Hello, my name's Mike King. This is the fourth in my series of talks exploring enlightenment. The theme for today is enlightenment and beauty. I've chosen beauty as a theme, a peg to hang a number of issues on, in returning in fact to three masters or spiritual teachers or spiritual figures that I've discussed so far, which is the Buddha, Plotinus and Walt Whitman. I've made the point before that Plotinus is lost to us in the West as a mere philosopher and Whitman as a mere poet, though their greatness in these areas is undisputed and not my concern. But their nature as spiritual teachers and as teachers of enlightenment is, of course, a new or provocative or controversial idea perhaps, introduced last time. Since the last talk, I've found myself returning to the Essential Plotinus, a translation by the Jesuit Elmer O'Brien, and found myself a little bit again getting the feel for him. I'm not as confident, anything like as confident in talking about him as I am with the Buddha, and I may or may not spend some time with him after this. But what struck me about the three men, the three protagonists, the three exemplars, that's the word I'm looking for, regarding spiritual teachings and enlightenment, is that beauty is an interesting theme to link them by. So I'll start with running quickly through the very different responses beauty engenders in them, and then go one by one through them in a bit more detail. The point is not so much about beauty, but how very differently in each case the journey away from the conventional self towards either no self, an elevated self, or expanded self in each case, looks very different, and which is why we wouldn't normally group these three under any heading, any same heading, and certainly not as teachers of enlightenment, which is the phrase the Buddha uses for himself, and the other two do not. They don't use the word enlightenment. So that's where we're heading today. The beauty as a term here I'm using partly as a way to extract different views about self in the teachings of these three men, but also as a way of describing a love of life, an engagement with life through beauty. Now, we all have some perhaps fundamental love of life in some aspect of life, and our access to our enjoyment of life, our appreciation of life, our commitment to living will come from many different things. It could come from family, it could come from one's profession, it could come from philosophy or poetry. But I'm using beauty here because I think that's my first response to life. It is not purely aesthetic, and it's not purely a visual term. We will see that beauty is applicable to all three of our thinkers, our teachers, across the sense spectrum. So it could be visual, auditory, it could be the beauty of taste, of touch. I forget, what's the fifth one? Anyway, you get my drift. It could be the beauty of ideas, or it could be the beauty we find in justice, in truth. And the Greeks, it seemed, were more or less relating to life through the triad of truth, beauty and justice. And each one can be found in the other. In truth there is beauty and justice. In beauty there has to be something true and something just, it's maybe not easy to discern. And justice is necessarily true, but is received as beautiful. A moment of justice moves one in a way that beauty does. But I perfectly understand that for many people beauty is not their particular way into life. I'm using it here because it's relevant to these three people and their approach to life, which is extremely different, very different indeed. So very quickly, the Buddha's approach to beauty is that it is a trap. It is a snare laid by Mara, the devil, to engage one in sense pleasure of any different kind, which leads to craving, which leads to, if I think of his sequence, the long sequence which leads to suffering. So for him, the escape from suffering necessarily entails the escape from beauty. So that is a very quick summary. We'll go back to a much more detailed account of the Buddha and beauty. Plotinus is the exact opposite. Beauty is his favorite term. The beautiful, the good, the one are the highest principles for him. And beauty, he returns to in the visual arts. He's interested in all the arts. He's interested in governance. He's interested in life in a way that the Buddha simply isn't. Just as an example, a very simple one, he is a responsible man in his community in a way that the Buddha wasn't. They both have sanghas, but Plotinus is connected with the outside world for instance, in this simple example that comes to mind, in that he takes on orphans and ensures that their estates are properly invested for their adulthood. This is an engagement with commerce, finance, responsibility, and young life, not because he wants them to become monks and attain enlightenment, but simply out of a general love for the human condition. I mean, it's a little flag of interest. Whitman's approach to life is not explicitly about the beautiful, because everything to him is beautiful, and to extract just this one quality, say, of visual beauty wouldn't make sense to him. A person not in the least visibly beautiful, but dear to him, is immensely meaningful. In nature, a quagmire or a bog or a muddy place, which in those days particularly were not regarded as beautiful, is as profound and as meaningful as more conventional, beautiful sky or trees or sunsets or things like this. So, for the Buddha, beauty is a trap. For Plotinus, it is his highest value. For Whitman, it is diffuse across all of experience, all of life, all of which he holds precious. Relating this to my idea of no self, or let's say enlightenment as a radical re-evaluation of self, a discovery of a much more profound self, quite free, quite independent of the terms in which we are brought up and conventionally protect our reputation, our self, our personality, our ideas about personality. This very different view of person we can sum up in the three cases again very briefly. For the Buddha, self contracts to nothing. It is a complete extinguishing. That's a word he uses quite often. Nirvana, his highest value, means to snuff out. It means, and in fact the metaphor used is of a flame going out when it runs out of fuel. His technique, his meditations, his path is a removal of the fuel that powers up our false sense of personality and engages us with the sensual world. And at the end of it, nirvana is when we are liberated completely from craving, from fear, and from illusion. And the principal illusion, though he never puts it this way, the principal illusion being that of selfhood. Personality view is the way he puts it. For Plotinus, the radical re-evaluation of self, not that he puts it that way, but it's an elevation, it's an upward journey. It's an ascent to the divine, and self there is understood very differently from the conventional self. So for the Buddha, a contraction, for Plotinus, an ascent, and for Whitman, an expansion. It is, using spatial metaphors, a horizontal expansion. He becomes everything he sees and encompasses lovingly all he sees, and everything that he sees is good. No two things are alike, he says, and each one good. Now, this was before the age of mass production, but even then I think he'd find a way around that. This immense optimism and positivity apparently places him somewhere completely different to the Buddha. And yet what they have in common is to me extremely obvious. And in the three cases, we have examples of how enlightenment has taken an individual very differently. Their journey to it is very different, and how they present it is very different, and their cultural milieu is very different. Plotinus, there is much in Plotinus's life and thinking that resonates with the Buddha. For example, he becomes a spiritual teacher in a formal sense. He has a sangha, that is a spiritual community around him. He has disciples around him. And he also, like the Buddha, has erased personal history. I mean, the Buddha will occasionally speak about his journey to enlightenment. Plotinus, I think I've mentioned this, is much more rigorous in attempting to erase everything of his past. And though we do know something quite a bit through one of his pupils called Porphyry and others, who give us little fragments of his life and journey and his journey to enlightenment. Whitman is at ease with all that is human. There is nothing human that he rejects. He, for instance, his magnanimity is directed to women in a way that the Buddha would find impossible. The Buddha, at one point, for instance, is in a household where he seems to have had some hand in helping a woman reach the end of a very difficult pregnancy. I mean, the period, the term of it seems to be physically impossibly long, but she's delighted to have given birth to a son, and he's almost swept up with it, and then very quickly corrects himself that the pleasure and delight she experiences is in fact suffering. And when she then goes on to say that she now wants another son because she's so delighted that this pregnancy has come to terms successfully, he's scathing of her. He is happy enough later in his life for women to enter the Sangha and become enlightened when their role as mothers are put behind them, and their role as temptress is put behind them. Plotinus, actually I can't offhand think of an example to give, but clearly he's at ease with family life and in adopting orphans and looking after them is a fatherly kind of figure. Whitman is extraordinary. He rises above his time so wonderfully in that in almost every sentence where he refers to a man, he includes a woman explicitly. I think the feminists have missed out on him because, from another angle, I can't remember which commentator, dwells on his rank masculinity. So, interesting. Another little snippet that springs to mind is he talks about a prostitute with her bedraggled shawl. The men jeer at her, and he says very simply, "I do not jeer." He feels for her. He feels for all of human conditions. Is actually more comfortable with the ordinary people, a cab driver, a sailor, than the great and the good, though he mingles with them, with presidents and celebrities of all kinds, poets. He's at ease with everything, but ultimately it's the ordinary man and woman. And here's another thing that Buddha wouldn't say in a million years, and I'm always fond of this. Whitman says, there is nothing better in life than the well-married man and well-married woman. He adds too that people rarely understand him. This is of course true of all teachers of enlightenment. They are speaking about a condition of personhood that is so far removed from the conventions of personhood. But he says that it is more likely that young mothers will get him than any other sort of person, and I think that's lovely. He likes children. Apparently he used to volunteer in a school, and on a summer's afternoon in a meadow, you'd find a child asleep, fallen asleep in his lap. Not conceivable today. So that is a quick run through of how these three great teachers, in my opinion, respond to beauty, and as a way of saying a little bit about how they respond to life and how their teachings of enlightenment regarding personhood will be very different. But I do think all land up in the same place and simply prove that what you do with enlightenment is unpredictable. How it takes you is unknown. I have met in my hometown and in a neighbouring city, in the space of 2 years, I have met 4 enlightened persons, people at the very least with a profound glimpse, whose personalities are clearly transformed. And just to run through that list of 4, one was a shop assistant in an Asian and African store, actually a Krishna devotee, but when she spoke to me of her inner world, I sensed something rather like Susan Blackmore, somebody who proves the scriptures by their own experience rather than the other way around. Another one was an American psychotherapist who turned up in town and with whom we had an extraordinary series of meetings, after which he commented that it was like the meeting between Rumi and Shamsi Tabriz. Don't know which way around he meant. But yes, he has engaged in some spiritual teaching. The third local person was simply somebody who wandered into the Buddhist center, and after a while, after discussion with him, I thought, yeah, he's got it. Actually, this isn't the right place for you. But I never saw him again. I don't know what happened to him. I hope he's okay. And the fourth, in a nearby city, was a Roman Catholic priest. I'd gone for Mass. I like Mass. And the sermon was so remarkable that I buttonholed him afterwards and questioned him. And our conversation struck him of interest. He gave me his phone number and we met up. And again, we had this remarkable, absolutely remarkable encounter. And he, again, unprompted, said it reminded him of the meeting between Rumi and Shamsi Tabriz. And we must look at that sometime. So, enlightenment turns up in unusual places. I'm saying this again by way to justify something that has to be justified to consider both Plotinus and Whitman as teachers of enlightenment. Whitman in particular would be an unusual choice for most. Okay, that's by way of introduction. Let us contemplate a little bit, or let me mull over the question of beauty for a moment before then turning to each one in turn. Beauty has grown in my life as a central impulse, or as a central response to the ordinary world. I go out of the front door, and it has been my habit for 30 years, ever since I broke my collarbone and couldn't take public transport in London because I was jostled. I started walking, and I gained the habit of what I now call walkabout. I walked something like 10,000 miles through the East End over a period of 15 years. And I recognize, for instance, in some of the nature mystics or in cultures like the Aborigines that talk about walkabout, that's where I've got the term from, and in Thoreau when he was on Walden Pond, and in the nature mystics and elsewhere, that simply being out and about with no particular purpose. Whitman is very good at this. I often go for a pint of milk and I head up in the exact opposite direction of the shop, and 3 miles later I land up there, do my shopping and come home. And as Whitman says, each thing is good out there and no two things alike. They are all beautiful, though not necessarily in a classic sense. I like photography, and I will photograph industrial estates and graffiti and things, all kinds of things. So I appreciate the photographic eye in others, and there's some incredible photography out there. It embodies actually what Baudrillard discovered in his photography, something you could call suchness. Whitman uses the term inherency. Things have an inherency, that they are themselves. And to rest in that is, I find beautiful, peaceful. Meister Eckhart used Istigkeit, the German for isness or suchness. And somewhere throughout the Buddha's teachings, there is this sense of suchness. He describes himself as the Tathagata, which means thus gone, but there's another related word called, I think, Tathata, meaning suchness. It is the world unmediated. It is the world as it presents itself raw, before concepts and thought classified, before thought is engaged. Thought actually runs kind of in parallel to our cognitive apparatus. And many would say that it's impossible to know the world unmediated. Well, it is in fact the goal of the Buddha. He speaks about knowing thoughts, for instance, as they arise, are present and disappear, to know sights, sounds. And this word know, he explains at some point as direct knowing, in other words, direct cognition. Those trained in the sciences and influenced in their thinking by the sciences will often be triggered by such a claim into rehearsing for themselves what they know about, for instance, the optic nerve, the function of the part of the brain that deals with sight and so forth, and say that all experience is mediated. Well, direct experience, and this is where meditation and mindfulness come in, teach one that that is not the case. You can rehearse this inferential chain of cognitive science discovered by the scientists as a mental rehearsal of what you know, but that doesn't change the fact that all your experience is direct. And we discovered this through mindfulness and observe then that our trains of thought then impose values and concepts on it. In encountering the world raw, naked, through complete mindfulness, that is, without allowing the mind to divide it into good and bad, for instance, and beautiful and ugly, I actually find the world beautiful. But that clearly I'm using in a slightly specialist sense. I use the word beautiful to describe, as Whitman would, all of life, including its sufferings. That's a very tough thing to say. I'll come back to it perhaps at another point. But as I say, beauty is only one prism by which to experience life and to celebrate life and to hold life dear, which the Buddha does not seem to, and which Whitman does, and somewhere in the middle stands Plotinus, because he divides life into the upper and lower parts, if you like, and the upper parts are the truly beautiful, and the lower parts have a beauty which is merely borrowed from the upper parts. And sometimes this kind of philosophy is called emanationism, that the world, the material world, the physical world we know, is an emanation of something higher. I don't think Whitman would fall into that category. He sees the physical world as equal to the soul. And so he says very clearly somewhere, the soul must not be abased to the body. In other words, must not be dismissed as materialists were beginning to do in his time. And likewise, the body must not be abased to the soul, which is more or less the religious Christian heritage that he is quite indifferent to. He's not a Christian at all. We will journey into the world of the Christian mystics and their enlightened masters before long. But our three exemplars today are quite innocent of monotheism and Christianity in general. So, those are some remarks about beauty which relate to suchness, to mindfulness, it's a particular feel for the world, and it's because I was born into a family of artists on both sides. I'm a practicing artist, musician, poet, amateur, if you like, in all these fields. I dabble, but I'm always engaged with beauty in some way or other. So if that's not your thing, then I will leave it behind as we use it as simply a way into the teachings of these three men. So, turning to the Buddha, the only time I'm aware of where he uses the word beauty approvingly is of a higher altered state of consciousness. These are the dhyanas, the four dhyanas, and then there's four states above which have various different translations. In the Majjhima Nikaya, they are known as a base. Base is the plural, bases. Other translations use spheres, and both these terms hint at something like realm. They are higher realms. Sometimes they are called higher attainments, and I can't remember which one, but he is actually criticized for not finding the world beautiful, and or not being responsive to beauty. I can't remember how it goes, this sort of exactly, but his response is to say that the state known as the beautiful, so clearly it indicates that these states are known or were part of the language of his time. In other words, other holy men were describing them. they're not necessarily original part of his system. I don't think we have any way of knowing. So he says, he comes back, his riposte is that yes, this is the beautiful state. And in a sense, because he describes the pleasure in all 8 of these higher states, you could be saying, and approvingly, whereas sense pleasures he always describes disapprovingly, you could say he finds beauty in these higher states, and that he would have that in common with Plotinus. But generally, beauty in the physical world is Mara's snare, Mara's trap, and invites you to dwell in sense pleasures and therefore be subject to craving, which leads you away from the path to enlightenment and leads you directly to suffering. Another time where he does use beauty is in the negative, and when he is describing people. A beautiful person, if they are attractive to you, and mostly it's women, are again Mara's snare. And there is a very humorous passage where a monk tells him he's going to give up. He's in the Sangha, but he's going to give up because he's fallen in love with a beautiful Sakyan girl. Sakyans was the clan, the tribe that the Buddha comes from, or the people around him. And the Buddha, this is quite unusual for him, decides on a course of action involving taking this man into a spirit world where the gods there are beautiful. And in general, he will use beautiful to describe the gods, and he's not uncomfortable about that. And here, the female gods, the devas, are so exquisitely beautiful, they're described as having dove-like ankles, or something like that. And he promises this monk 500 of them, if he stays in the Sangha. And the monk is overwhelmed because he says any one of them is so exquisitely beautiful that it makes the woman he was in love with and had formerly thought beautiful look like a cauterized monkey with its ears and nose cut off. I mean, it's a hideous image. The whole thing's horrible. And so that's the deal. And but he foolishly lets the other monks, know of this deal because presumably they ask him why he isn't leaving after all. And he says, well, the Buddha has promised me 500 of these nymphs in this other world, that they mock him for it, rightly, that this isn't the basis on which one should pursue enlightenment. And so he gives that up in the end and buckles down to the work of meditation, and I can't remember if he attains or not. And then he goes to the Buddha, yes, I think that's how it works, and tells him that he has reached, and that he releases the Buddha from his vow of the 500 nymphs in this other world. And the Buddha said, yes, I had already known that, and so he had already known that he was released from this vow, which I don't know how seriously he intended it. Now, this is both humorous and quite possibly a true account of what passed between the Buddha and this monk. But it, again, is emblematic of his approach to beauty. And it is difficult to put this forward, because I know this is distressing to many Buddhists and will put people off the Buddha. But you can sum up the Buddha's approach to life in one of his most extreme statements. He actually makes it to a spirit being, a big topic to come to at some point. But it wouldn't matter who he put it to, who asks him how he attained enlightenment. And he says different things at different times. In this particular occasion, he says he attained through the utter destruction of delight in existence. I must admit, when I read that, I thought, what am I doing? Why am I studying the Buddha's life and teachings? But I have made my own peace with it. It is not a one-off. It is the most extreme version of many statements by him where he talks about eliminating delight in anything. His meditation is extremely austere, his path is austere, and you should leave behind all desire and craving without residue, and that includes for the pleasures of the 8 higher states that I mentioned early on. They too are a fetter, they too are conditioned arising. They are simply, again, he's not that explicit about this, I've mentioned it before, they are part of the journey away from sense pleasures, but then their pleasures have to be abandoned too. His journey is to not being, to the end of being, to the end of birth, to cessation. It's not perhaps as extreme as he sounds, but he is far more often likely to say that attainment is the end of birth. There will be no more birth. And this, of course, is in the context of a universal belief in reincarnation. He is at pains, however, to say that this is a middle way, that there is moderation in this, and I think he's right, there is. It takes some recovering. But in the context of the time, there were Brahmins like him, not that he was born a Brahmin, but he includes himself amongst these teachers of the time, who taught very different things. And at one extreme you had Brahmins who we would call materialists, who said that at death nothing survives, that is the end, we are material beings, there is nothing, there is no soul, and therefore there is no reincarnation and no rebirth. And these are called, the terminology used, these are called annihilationists, because self is annihilated at death. The Buddha disputes that. He doesn't agree with that. So when we talk about the end of self, he's not talking about annihilation of self. And in fact, those who seek annihilation are as misguided as those who seek the conventional pleasures of self, or the opposite extreme, the belief that other Brahmins put forward, which is known as eternalism, that the self is eternal and unchanging. That is also for him a wrong belief. And his middle way is between the position of the eternalists and the annihilationists. And sometimes this gets muddled up because the annihilationists are talking about something very specific, which is in the denial of reincarnation. They are not nihilists necessarily, that would be something different. So, what happens to self, as far as the Buddha is concerned, is neither annihilation nor perpetuation. And I think it's why I persist with him. I think this is very interesting. And it is not so clear in the teachings of other masters, and that's why I go back to him as the most austere and as the most analytical, and yet I cannot possibly agree with him, his approach to beauty and to life. Mine is much more the path of Whitman, or Plotinus for that matter. So, the Buddha's temperament inclines him to a horror of suffering. He is a deeply loving man, benign, kindly, generous, and he sees suffering in all realms. The animal realm to him is one of horror and predation and suffering. He could not conceive, as Whitman, of saying, as Whitman did, in his rare moment of, he's not often irritated with human company, but in a rare moment Whitman says, I sometimes think I could turn and live with the animals, because not one is respectable or unhappy. The Buddha would not conceivably say that. Animals know only suffering as far as he's concerned. So I'll leave the Buddha there, having slightly forgotten my train of thought, and turn to Plotinus. The little bit of immersion I've had since my last talk in Plotinus has inspired me. Even today I picked up his chapter on the descent of the soul, and the opening passage on it is absolutely stunning. According to the translator, he doesn't often include his own experience when talking, just as the Buddha doesn't often reminisce about his own experience. And so it inspires me perhaps to go through the entire Enneads and collect together all references he makes to his own journey or to his own experience. Here, Plotinus says very simply at the head of the tractate, this happens often, and then says, and I'm not going to read out loud in these talks. It is so beautifully put, and so uniquely put, and so densely put, that I've read the passage over and over and I haven't memorized it. He says he enters his self, goes inward and ascends, and knows his identity as the divine, his identity with the divine, or his divine self. He is essentially doing what the Buddha does when he does not have to engage in discourse or discussion and can place himself in the higher, one of these higher 8 states. Sometimes he will confide to Ananda that he abides mostly in voidness. The concept of abiding, he asks his monks or comments that they dwell in different pleasant abidings, which we would just see them sitting there in meditation, and they're all in slightly different places, which is interesting. And at another time, Sariputta mentions to him that he abides mostly in voidness. And I can't remember which one of the 8 states this is. But I think Plotinus had this capacity then to propel himself into something similar, but he describes it as an ascent. And I'm going to have to look it up because I meant to memorize these words. Yes. Because they're so unique. He says at the end of this little paragraph that utter actuality is mine. This is unique and extraordinary and beautiful. Utter actuality is sort of a bit what I was talking about earlier. Suchness, isness, istigkeit. The world as it presents itself to you, unmediated. The world that Baudrillard explored in his photography, and which his description of resonates with this, even though his philosophies suggest that he's a man not generally inclined to mindfulness or meditation, but through photography he would photograph canals and rusty cars and all sorts of things. I don't know why it's come to mind actually, but the phenomenon of enlightenment, if you take it in the expanded self that I'm trying to convey, takes you everywhere in life. It encompasses everything. So, in this rare account of Plotinus, he describes this ascent into a divine place and a place of utter actuality. And I guess that, like the Buddha, he can abide there, but chooses, again, it's a bit of guesswork. I would know better if I spent some time with him. But he's very engaged in the world. His descent is not into something fallen, exactly. He takes pains to counter the Gnostic view of the world, which may anyway misrepresent the Gnostics, but it is a view that is out there, that the world is a fallen place. For the Buddha, he doesn't use that term, but clearly the world of the physical world, the world of human life, holds no attraction to him, so by definition it is fallen. Amongst the Manichaeans and the Gnostics and the Christians who are inclined to this viewpoint, the world is fallen. Plotinus objects to this, and I think that's because there is a love for the world. There is a love for the arts, there is a love for good governance, there is a love for the honourable life. The lowest life, the sensate world, as he calls it, he doesn't dismiss it, he doesn't call it dishonourable, but he says the strivings in that world are of that sensate nature, which will be to keep safe, to protect, to gain wealth, family, and all the ordinary things of life, which for him take their beauty from the higher realm. He doesn't dismiss that sensate world. But the honourable life is lived in the pursuit of justice, in governance, in putting yourself last, and considering the well-being of all your fellow men, to which Plotinus devoted himself. And I would say this is, to me, what no self really means, that you abandon the total preoccupation with one's own happiness, one's own flourishing, and place that flourishing simply alongside the flourishing of all beings. It doesn't mean necessarily self-sacrifice. It doesn't mean neglecting one's own needs, because if you neglect the needs of the sensate world, then somebody else is going to have to look after you. And while you're competent and capable, it would be a burden on others if you neglected your own fundamental needs. The Buddha was entirely dependent, his monks were entirely dependent on others. And I'm not the sort of person who would be comfortable with that, even if it was the culture. Well, I mean, how can I say? If it was the culture, I suppose I would be comfortable with it. But to go on an alms round when I could grow my own food or be self-sufficient, a monastery in the Christian world was generally self-sufficient. I think in the Chinese world too. Though that didn't prevent, of course, the wealthy from endowing monasteries. So they became very rich, and the temptations that wealth bring were one of the reasons for the Reformation, of course. So Plotinus is engaged in the world. There is a sensate life. He doesn't call it brutish, which other commentators, religious figures through history, he says, he uses this rather lovely neutral word, sensate. But above that there is an honourable life where you dedicate yourself to others. And clearly the notion of self in those two states is different. And the notion of self in that ascent, in that ascended place is different again. And he's a wonderful teacher. Like the Buddha, he knows, I think instinctively, as all teachers of enlightenment do, that the pupil who succeeds is perhaps rare, but it is not actually difficult. The Buddha says you can hear the Dharma in the evening and be enlightened by the morning. You can hear the Dharma in the morning and be enlightened by the evening. Plotinus says that the ascent can be quite quick. It doesn't have to take forever. I'm sure amongst his pupils, just amongst the Buddha, as amongst the Buddhas, he could see the person who was going very slowly. The Buddha nags Ananda a lot because Ananda never reaches in the Buddha's lifetime. And he can see the one that's going to get there very fast, and some of the encounters he has with potential pupils, enlightenment can be almost instant. Or it can take 1,000,000 lifetimes. There seems to be no rhyme or reason to it, unless you have known the trajectory, perhaps, of that person over many lifetimes. But that's, as I say, that whole business of reincarnation is for another day. Actually, while on the subject, because we're going to be dealing with Whitman shortly, he says that no doubt he is the leaving of many lives. It is one of many hints that Hindu commentators picked up on, and others, that he somewhat did believe in reincarnation. Not essential at all. We can do the whole enlightenment thing without it. With it, one gains a slightly different picture of it, and I'll spend time on that later. So I'm going to leave Plotinus there reluctantly, because there would be much more to say about this beautiful man. There's a portrait of him on the cover of the book. I think I mentioned last time that he wouldn't allow people to take portraits, so they had to smuggle an artist in to make sketches from which we have a face that is full of benignity. This is the word, I can't remember if I've used it before. I think Porphyry, his biographer, mentions this. So another thing in common with the Buddha, that this is a deeply kindly man, a gentle teacher, and this benignity, I've experienced it in the company of such people, flows out to those assembled in front of him. And he had something called conferences. This, instead of discourses, Plotinus has conferences. And he is apparently very willing to engage in question and answer, rather like the Buddha's engagements, and some think to the detriment of his actual teachings, but I think probably the other way around, because the teachings themselves always ossify. They become a system, and they become a doctrine that then forms the basis of a religion. So I mentioned before too that Plotinus could have become the basis of the Western religion under the rule of a particular emperor. I think it was Justinian. The Buddha's religion only became universally known because of Ashoka, the emperor. Whitman had no emperor around him, and we turn to Whitman now. But William James, who wrote the Varieties of Religious Experience, devoted some time to Whitman and seemed to deplore the fact that Whitmanism appeared to be a growing religion at the time. He wasn't comfortable with that at all. And so yes, I would have loved it had Whitman become the religion of the West, blossoming from the late 19th century and informing our life today. In a sense, by writing this book about Whitman and talking about him, there's still a faint hope it could happen. I did describe last time the Enlightenment experience, or the moment in Whitman's life that commentators think that the transformation took place, using the language of his disciple Richard Morrisbach, the moment in which cosmic consciousness entered him, or he became one with it, or however we want to speak. And that he was quite transformed, and that his poetry was quite transformed, which is interesting. Plotinus didn't write till quite late in life. He didn't want to, but at some point thought he should systematize his conferences. Whitman knew he was a spiritual teacher, and it is clear from his disciples that he was. And I mentioned last time this lovely passage in Leaves of Grass where he says, "Grey-necked, grizzled, forbidding, I stand to be wrestled with for the solid prizes of the universe, for these I afford to those who persist with me. He is forbidding, he is formidable. I'm sure Plotinus was, and if I were to read wider, I may uncover a moment where Plotinus is encountering somebody who is like Satyakar, whatever his name was, the holy man who came full of arrogance. It is natural. The philosophers of the period were in dispute with him, and they want to pull him down, some of them, because his reputation is growing. Whether there's a comparable incident, I don't know. Whitman is formidable in the sense of, and this is a comparison used, of some majestic natural phenomenon like a mountain. He is grave at times, like the Atlantic Ocean that he loved to walk by. He was never more at ease and at home with himself than by the ocean, we learn. He grew up on Long Island. He does love nature, but he's not a nature mystic in the sense that other nature mystics are, because most of the nature mystics are drawn to nature because they have, to one degree or another, given up on the human world. That is not Whitman at all. He doesn't elevate nature, forests, wilderness over the human. The city is a wilderness. Actually, this is me talking now. I find cities to be a wilderness or simply of a different kind. I encounter different creatures which are humans. And Whitman says, for instance, he uses the religious language of his day a little bit. He says, and I just remember this now, I spotted it in my book, where I set out to describe his religious system, his spiritual system, as one can sum up the Buddhas. I'm not going to sum it up, but this poem I use in the book starts off with him saying something like, he is at ease with God and with death. He says, no array of terms can tell you how at ease he is with God and with death. He finds God in everything and everywhere, and God leaves his letter, drops his letters, signs I suppose, but he uses the word letter, everywhere. And he doesn't pick them all up because he knows that more letters will be dropped later. He's using the metaphor of God. He's using the term God to say that he is at ease with God and that he finds the divine everywhere. He finds God everywhere, but he has absolutely, how did he put it now? Something like that he cannot explain God. He has no words to describe God, and he's not interested in, as the Christians are, in endless explanations. He's perfectly comfortable not to understand God in the slightest. Which you can't. If you have an ultimate, and that's all he's using the word God for, it could be nirvana, you can't actually explain it. Of course not. And he goes on to describe how he is at ease with death, that his corpse will make good manure and it will reach up to the leaves of roses and the polished breasts of melons. Well, here his poetry is very beautiful. His Leaves of Grass is a beautiful book. I don't read it as poetry. It's the art form I'm least drawn to because it involves words. And as a wordsmith, I've written 11 books, 50, God knows, academic papers and reviews, and I'm a wordsmith and I can put words together, if you like. because of that, I trust words far less, I think, than the average person. I can see so easily, because I've written fiction as well, how you can manipulate the reader into seeing this, that, or the other. And a bit like, say, in films, where they use music to tell you what to feel. I can't stand it. A film where the music already tells you that something tragic is going to happen. I let the filmmaker do their job properly and not fake it with music. And it's the same with words. Words are very devious things, and I will spend probably a talk or two, or at least one, exploring this issue about words. Whitman is a beautiful poet. To the extent that I do appreciate poetry, he writes wonderful poetry. But the interesting thing is that he confesses to, I think it may have been one of his disciples called Carpenter, that he hides his teachings, he hides his truths in his poetry. The exact opposite to the Buddha, who is very clear that nothing is hidden, there's nothing esoteric, he says it like it is. Plotinus too just says it straight. Whitman has not set himself up as a teacher. It is only the passer-by who will encounter him, though in fact through his writings people come to him, it is true, later on. And he has this lovely image of how he hides his truths, his most precious thoughts and teachings. He says he's like a furtive old hen in the hedgerow who looks up and down the road to make sure nobody is there before they lay their eggs in the grass, and then scuttles off. So finding the eggs in Whitman is a great pleasure, a great joy, and one has guidance from 4 or 5 writers of that period. And it reminded me earlier today that I read these authors, which are Burroughs, Traubel, Carpenter, Buck, Victorian writers. I had to read their books, which were roughly 100 years old at the time or more, in the great round reading room of the British Library before the library was moved to St Pancras. You would sit on the green leather benches where Marx, Dickens, Engels and the nature mystic Richard Jefferies were researching and writing. And you would order the books, which took 2 or 3 days to come, and I'd have these extraordinary volumes, and I had to make pencil notes. You weren't allowed to take anything in with ink. I still have those pencil notes of these books. Now I have them all on disc when I came to write the book. And I gained this picture of Whitman through his disciples, and then, based on their assessment of him, you can work through Leaves of Grass not as a volume of poetry, but as a volume of teachings of enlightenment, of an extraordinary, expansive kind. Just one little anecdote about the round reading room. It dawned on me that the term I would use to describe Whitman came to my mind. This is the odd thing about being a writer or being a human, that words come to you that out of nowhere, and you think, well, what do they mean? What could they mean? And the word was embracive. I pulled down a vast, the bigger Oxford English Dictionary, which was available on the shelves there, and found that yes, it had been used a few times. It was a thing. It was a word. If the dictionary wasn't about 4 inches thick, then it wouldn't have it in it. Embracive. And interestingly, it is exactly this quality of expansivity, of inclusiveness, of embraciveness in Whitman's writing that led D.H. Lawrence to write one of his least generous assessments of another poet or writer in his volume on American literature. And he's quite horrible to Whitman. He says, you're like a steam engine, puff, puff, puff. Your soul has leaked out into the universe. Well, exactly. Leak is the wrong word. But this is a path to enlightenment, where instead of progressively eliminating anything in the Buddha's 5 aggregates, eliminating I, me and mine in everything, you do the opposite. You progressively identify with more. So if you start with the first of the Buddha's aggregates, the body or the material world, you, and this is a difficult thing to say, you start seeing other bodies as equally your own. Now, that doesn't mean that you lose the sense of social boundary at all. In fact, you become more respectful to others, not less, because when you're not bounded in that sensate lower realm, as Plotinus would put it, or bound by the cravings of sense pleasures, as the Buddha puts it, you do not see other bodies as a means to your own gratification. That is the what you could say the ultimately narrow sense of identity, where you see others as either a threat or as providing you with what you crave for, what you believe you are entitled to. And from there stems a descent into what is truly brutish, where you use other people in all kinds of ways, physically, for physical pleasure, or you enslave them in various ways. So that's not what we're talking about here. You come to see other selves in their bodies as equally yourself. This is what D.H. Lawrence, in a racist moment, says, Whitman, you have become the greasy Eskimo. Clearly for Lawrence, such a person was contemptible. This is the received racism of his day. And the fact that Whitman could embrace people. He picked up, I think, on Whitman's love of the ordinary person in whatever culture. Who knows? It was D.H. Lawrence on a bad day. On a good day, he is quite wonderful and spiritual. But this expansiveness of self, for Whitman, can be mistaken for an inflated ego. And amongst the Jungians, there is a fear of this inflation, and they can be very skeptical of this as a genuine, something genuine, and not as something pathological. But Whitman's description of people and places and the world, his poem, his longest poem, or very long poem, called Song of Myself, sounds like a narcissistic indulgence, but he is singing of valleys and moss and wrens, and he says of a mouse that the extraordinary hinges in its fingers. He must have had a mouse in his hand. He doesn't actually say so, but he must have picked up a mouse, perhaps fed it, and the mouse was comfortable, and he could look at these tiny little paws and think of those tiny, tiny little digits. And he says the smallest hinge in the hand of a mouse is enough to stagger sextillions of infidels. Beautiful sense that, yes, if you're in that mood to observe the natural world, it is staggering. When a creature comes up and you rest in its eyes, it doesn't matter what it is. Hopefully it's not one that wants to eat you, but I've experienced this with a fox once in a wood in London. I spotted it at the same time as it spotted me, and we had a moment, very short, where we rested in each other's eyes. Two beings intermingling their being. You get this when you fall in love and you can look into the eyes of your beloved. Eye contact is a fraught matter. But you really, something mingles. And this expansion, we could call it love, Whitman feels everywhere in the natural world. His song of himself, his Leaves of Grass was once described as a mixture of the Bhagavad Gita and an auctioneer's catalogue. I'm going to stop there a moment. My camera is flashing and I can't remember what that means. Hello again. Sorry for the break. I have to confess I've slightly lost my train of thought. I'm talking about Whitman, and what comes to mind now as a natural continuation is this sense of expansivity. There is no doubt that his writings suggest that he was capable of entering empathetically into almost anything, to becoming almost anything, to being almost anything. He gives long lists of what he is. And one of my favourite little images that he conjures is with the words, "I find myself stuccoed with birds and quadrupeds all over." Stuccoed is I don't exactly know what it means, but it certainly implies that they are stuck to him, not separate. He is one with them. His benignity, his amiability, his comradeship, this is a word he uses very often, lives with this enormous self-reliance and pleasure in his own company. He says, while others dispute, I go off, bathe and admire myself. Again, it sounds narcissistic, but in reality he served. His kindness spilled out in rather wonderful ways. For example, during the Civil War, which he didn't fight in, he attended a hospital near him where the wounded and dying soldiers were laid out, I imagine, in a very crude sense, with only very crude medical interventions available. And he would take a whole hamper full of oranges and sweets, distribute them, talk with them, and the most wonderful thing he did for them, they were all illiterate, uneducated men, and he would write letters home for them. They would dictate something to their sweetheart or mother or friends. He would write them and post them for them so that they knew that their last thoughts were going to the people they cared about. His sheer presence on the ward meant that they always, when he left, they say, "Are you coming back tomorrow?" He meant the world to them, and it was such a simple thing to do. At another time, actually, it's worth saying that he comments of the agonies of these soldiers. Whatever pain relief they had would have been very primitive or absent altogether, and they were dying in agony, many of them. And he says they don't need to describe that agony to him. He knows that agony already. He feels it directly. I don't exactly know what to make of this, but when you empathize, deeply empathize with somebody and they're hurt, in any kind of way, you are hurt too. The boundary between self and other has disappeared in that sense, but in all ordinary senses, his boundaries between self and other are that of a deeply honourable kind. He knew exactly what he was entitled to and what others were entitled to. And another incident that shows how he plunged himself into the life of others and helped where he could was with a cab driver that he was friendly with, who drove a hansom cab, so horse and cab. And this man fell ill one winter and could not support his family, and they would have starved. They would have had to beg from neighbours or goodness knows. And he simply drove the cab for him, collected the fares, handed them over, and allowed the family to eat that winter. Life in Victorian American cities was not easy. So this expansiveness of Whitman is... sorry about that, another technical hitch. I was wanting to wrap up by finishing off with some remarks about Whitman and then summing up what we've been exploring today. A few more things just to say about Whitman. I was talking about his engagement with ordinary people, helping them out, both the dying soldiers and his friend with the cab. These are simply examples of how he was engaged with life in all its aspects. And so if we go back to beauty as the theme, I've suggested that beauty for Whitman was in everything, and he didn't single out this, that or the other as being beautiful in the sense that Plotinus does with the arts. And more significantly still, he does not see the beauty of things in ordinary life as borrowed beauty. This is their own beauty, this is their own meaning. Everything here is meaningful. And yet, the soul, there is a higher self, there is a soul. He, in a sense, places soul and body equal, and therefore doesn't make this distinction that Plotinus does. I did find evidence when I was looking that Whitman certainly isn't a Christian. There's not a shred of Christianity in his thinking, other than using the word God, which was simply a term available to him to indicate the all, the everything, the one that Plotinus would have been talking about. It's certainly not theistic or a being. Whitman's beauty then is diffuse, it's in everything, it's not borrowed. Plotinus's beauty is borrowed from the higher realm, and in between that there lives the noble or honourable life. And here Whitman again doesn't consider that any particular profession, say artist or adjudicator or administrator, lives a more honourable life than anybody else. The sensate world, if we were to use Plotinus's term, is in itself a site of honour, honourable behaviour, dignity, and he finds this amongst the most ordinary of people everywhere. They respond to him, he rejoices in them. As I've said, he says very often it is young mothers who understand him best. But of his disciples, and we will look at them later on when we examine the master-disciple relationship, there were as many, in fact they probably all were more educated. And I think that's only because they were the ones who left records. We simply don't know how many lives he touched as an enlightened teacher, who was sparked off by him and whose lives were transformed by him. William James couldn't have been so anxious about Whitmanism as a religion if he were not, in fact, influencing the lives of quite a number of people. So to round off, I've used beauty here as a way in to assess or pin down the attitude of an enlightened person to life itself. And we find three very contrasting figures. The Buddha is a renunciate. I can't think of a more extreme example where everything of ordinary life is given up for living in the forest, alone preferably, though later on the Sangha, the community developed, and engaging in meditation as much as possible, bar the daily alms round where you went begging for food to the local community. Plotinus is embedded in a culture of work, of hierarchy. He engages with wealthy people and the poor. He is a lofty soul. He has lofty concerns, art, the sciences of the day, governance. He regards the ordinary world of the body as not fallen or in itself necessarily vicious or brutal or brutish, as many religious people have declared it, but living with the borrowed beauty. Whitman sees this earthly life as complete and imbued with its own meaning and beauty, and from which there is nothing that is alien to him. There's nothing foreign, separate, distinct, or evil. He says he is the poet of evil just as much as good. He says his poems may do more evil than good in the long run. This is modesty. I would say his poems have done a great deal of good. And above all, I would put him forward as an exemplar of a spiritual teacher, appropriate to the West and appropriate to now. That is to come. For now, we have explored the theme of beauty. I'll leave it there today. Thank you very much for listening.